Today, we're going to be talking about cognitive assessments. So before we begin, let me just introduce myself again. My name is Hadassah, and I'm a cognitive test developer at Job Test Prep. A little bit about my credentials. I hold a BSc in Neuroscience and Cognition Studies, and I also minored in philosophy. We'll revisit that later today. And I hope to help you gain helpful insight today on how to maximize your success when you do your cognitive assessments and hopefully land your dream jobs. So let's begin. So what are cognitive assessments? Briefly, they're usually standardized timed tests that are meant to measure certain things about the way that you think. So what they want to assess is your reasoning abilities, your attention, and this could be either your attention span or your attention to detail, your problem-solving skills, and if you're able to do quick thinking, if you're quick on your feet, if you can solve problems quickly. So what we have on the agenda today is we're going to talk about the format overview. This is going to be very brief. We won't touch on all the points. What I want to do is establish a baseline together so that when I make references, you understand what the confinements we have when we're talking about what we can and cannot do in cognitive assessments. Okay, this is important. I want you to understand what your restrictions are and what you have at your disposal. Next, we're going to talk about useful tips. So we're going to touch on logical reasoning today, numerical reasoning, and verbal reasoning. The reason we're going to focus only on these is because this is generally what you'll see in the world of finance. So I'm going to give you the most useful tips that we have so that you can answer these questions as quickly and as efficiently as possible. We will then take a short 5-minute break and move on to the time management section. We'll talk about strategies and example questions to see how you implement these strategies. This is a very important part of cognitive assessments that's often overlooked, but in fact, knowing how to answer the questions correctly doesn't boil down just to the actual content and being able to do the right calculations and such. It's also about managing your time efficiently and actually being able to see all the questions. Okay, and finally, at the end, we'll also leave a little bit of time for Q&A. Hopefully we'll have enough time for that. So please notice that you have an open chat in which you can submit questions to us, and I will do my best to answer any questions that might come up. Okay, so like I said, let's do a little overview and talk about the formatting of cognitive assessments. So generally speaking, these tests are timed, and they're actually it's very hard to do these tests on time. So you often have 20 to 90 seconds per question. That's not a lot of time. Okay, the question types generally will be different variations of multiple choice questions, which essentially means that there's always a bunch of options, but only one correct answer. Today, we'll be focusing on those type of questions. The next thing to understand is that usually you can skip and return. This means that if there's a question that you don't know how to answer, it's not a problem. You can actually just skip it and return in the end if you have enough time for it. We're going to talk about this later, but this is actually a very useful thing to know. And finally, there is no penalty for incorrect answers. What does this mean? This means that it's actually encouraged to make good guesses. Okay, so there is no penalty for answering wrong. That means you want to actually submit some kind of answer to every single question and up your chances that maybe some of them will be correct. And we'll talk about this later on as well, as we'll learn how to make good educated guesses. Okay, so let's dive right into it. The first thing we'll talk about today is useful tips regarding logical reasoning. As someone who studied philosophy, I can tell you that I have extensive knowledge on logical reasoning, but luckily for you, you guys really only need to know 4 basic logic rules to conquer almost all the different types of logical questions that you'll have. So the first logic rule is how to translate conditionals. So we want to understand what it means when you have a sentence that includes if something, then something. So when we speak in logic terms, we mean if A, then B. What does that mean? That means that only if A occurs, then B will occur, okay? And this only works in this direction, meaning only A will guarantee the occurrence of B and not the reverse. Let's look at an example. Say, if it rains, then the ground will be wet. This is not equal to, if the ground is wet, then it will rain, right? It's pretty obvious. This does not equal this, okay? So if it rains, the ground will be wet. But if the ground is wet, it does not mean that it will rain, okay? It's important to understand the relationship between different parts of logical statements so that you can then make the correct assumptions and the correct conclusions. The next logical rule is contrapositives. So something like A only if B means that B must occur so that A will occur. Again, A will happen only if B happens as well. So we need B to happen so that we can say that A is happening as well. Another way of looking at this is saying that if not B, meaning if B does not occur, then A will also not occur. Okay, and this is always valid. In this case, you can do the reverse, and this is always true. Let's look at an example. If I do my homework, okay, so this is if B, then A, I can go play outside. This is equal to, if I don't do my homework, if not B, then I cannot go play outside, then not A, okay? The third rule is the rule of chains. This one is fairly intuitive. So if A, then B, and if B, then C, then it concludes that if A, then C. What did I do here? I essentially just eliminated B as the middleman. Okay, I just took B out and said we don't actually need him. We can understand from this that A constitutes C. So let's look at an example. If my alarm clock goes off, then I will wake up on time, then I will make my bus. This is equal to, if my alarm clock goes off, then I will make my bus. Okay, we can actually take out the I will wake up on time. This is still a valid statement. And finally, the unless rule. If we have A unless B, this is also equal to saying if not B, then A. So A will occur unless B occurs, is the same as saying if B doesn't occur, then A will occur. For example, I can go to the concert unless I don't have a ticket. Okay, A, I can go to the concert unless B, I don't have a ticket. Or in other words, if I do have a ticket, which is the not B in this case, because B is not having a ticket. So if I don't not have a ticket means I do have a ticket, then A, then I can go to the concert. Okay, this is fairly complex, but actually simple when you spend a little bit of time thinking about it. I encourage you now to actually take a screenshot of this and come back to it so that you can remember these things. What I want you to do is when you're solving logical questions, try to understand the relationship between the different parts of the sentences or the statements. This is usually very helpful in actually simplifying what you're looking at. So you can go, oh, actually all they're saying is if A, then B, and I know what to do with that. All right. The next major tip that I have for logical reasoning questions is to learn how to draw out what you're being described, what is being described to you. So the two options that we generally say you should use is to use Venn diagrams and tables. So let's look at a Venn diagram example. So first, let's understand how the question works. Assume the first two statements are true and decide whether the third statement is true, false, or uncertain. All right, the first statement is all swimmers are strong. Okay, and we were told to assume that the first statement is true, so this is a true statement. The second true statement is that some strong people are also tall. Okay, the third statement is some swimmers are tall. Now I have to discern whether this is a true statement, a false statement, or if I'm uncertain about it based on the previous statements. Now, just getting the information like this, it's a little hard to understand and figure out in your head. Something that can be very useful is to just draw it out in a Venn diagram. So I know that all swimmers are strong, so I have a big circle for strong, and I'm going to put all swimmers to fit inside the strong circle, right? The next statement is some strong people are also tall. So I need to add a circle for tall people. And they told me that some of the strong people, rather, are also tall, so it partially overlaps. But wait a minute. I don't actually know exactly how the overlap works. So essentially, it can also look like this, right? And what the question is asking me is, some swimmers are tall. Maybe it can also have an overlap, or maybe there could be no overlap. I actually don't know from the information that I was given. And once I draw it out, I understand that the answer is uncertain. Okay, this is a great example for how actually mapping it out can really help us understand what the information that we gave us tells us and what it does not tell us. The next thing we'll talk about is an example of a question where using a table to draw things out can help us understand. So let's look at these four statements and then try to understand the following question. Okay, so the four statements are: Sarah is standing in the leftmost spot. Tom is standing next to Lily. Tom is standing 2 spots away from Sarah. And finally, Ben is not standing next to Lily. Wow, that's a lot of information and very hard to keep in your head and try to understand what's going on. Let alone look at which one of the following is possible and try to figure out who's standing next to who. Very difficult. So instead of trying to do it in our head, let's put it down on paper. Okay, so let's go back. Sarah is standing in the leftmost spot. I know what to do with that. I'm going to put Sarah in the leftmost spot. Good. Tom is standing next to Lily. Hold on. Lily's nowhere here. I don't know anything about Lily yet, so I don't know where to put Tom. So I'll move on to the next one. Tom is standing 2 spots away from Sarah. Okay, I know where Sarah is, so I have to put Tom 2 spots away. Okay, we're getting somewhere. And finally, Ben is not standing next to Lily. Wait, but Lily is still not on the board. Oh yeah, now that I put Tom on the board, I know that Tom is standing next to Lily, but hold on. Lily could be here or here. So I'll put her here, and then I see that if I put Ben here, then this also follows. Ben is not standing next to Lily. Okay, this is possible, but in fact, it is also possible to switch and put Ben here and Lily here. Okay, so these are all my options. Now let's look at the answers. So A, Tom is standing between Sarah and Lily. Let's see. Tom is standing between Sarah and Lily. At no point is he standing between Sarah and Lily. Okay, that's not the right answer. Lily is standing next to Ben. Is Lily standing next to Ben? No. Okay, not the right answer. C, Sarah is standing between Tom and Ben. Sarah is on the left corner. She's not standing between anyone. And finally, Lily is standing to the right of Tom. And the first option that I drew out, she is in fact standing to the right of Tom. So D must be the correct answer. This would have been very hard to solve just in my head. Okay, very easy to make a mistake. But you see how drawing it out made it, in fact, really simple. Okay, we are going to move on to numerical reasoning now. First thing I want to say to you is that I recognize that most of you probably have extensive knowledge in mathematics. Okay, this all of the information that I'm going to pass on now is in no way trying to say that you don't have advanced skills, but in fact, because you're so advanced and so skilled and you want to work in the finance world, you have to understand that when it comes to cognitive assessments, especially numerical reasoning, they're actually looking to revert you back to the bases, okay? So the best tips that I can give you today is actually to really hone it back and memorize your times table. I mean, like, know everything without having to think about anything, okay? Like, you don't need to do any kind of calculations. These are things that you should have right off the top of your head. Memorize conversions between fractions, percentages, and ratios. Having these conversions in your head, like, for example, knowing that 1/8 is equal to 12.5% without having to do the calculation is gold, okay? These are the best tips that I can give you. You want to maximize your time management. You want to be able to solve the questions as quickly as possible and move on, and having to do all of this is a waste of time, okay? And finally, similarly, you should really refresh your memory and remember all of the basic formulas, memorize them. This is a simple one, but generally speaking, you want to be able to do it right off the top of your head. You want to know all the formulas that you're going to have to use, okay? So any formula that you come across when you're practicing, write it down and take the time to memorize it. Okay, next, we're going to get a little more into detail here. I want you to remember that you can break down numbers into smaller parts and also use good estimation to answer questions faster. Okay, so often we don't really want to calculate the equations all the way through. We want to use a little bit of tricks, or we want to calculate them in a slightly different way than we're supposed to. Okay, so let's take an example question. So let's say we have to calculate 47 times 53. This isn't the easiest calculation, not the most difficult, but you can go wrong and it can be complicated and you can feel flustered while you're doing it when you only have, say, a minute. So another way of looking at these numbers is actually thinking, okay, what are they comprised of? So really 47 is just 40 and 7, and 53 is 50 and 3. And these numbers are a lot easier to work with. So actually, you can do a much simpler calculation where you say, okay, if I multiply 40 by 50 and 40 by 3 and 7 by 50 and 7 by 3, and I add it all up together, this is the correct answer to this question. I don't actually have to do long multiplication or the classic multiplication to get the right answer. And here, as you can see, this is much easier. 40 times 50, easy, it's 2,000, right? 7 times 50, again, an easy calculation, 350. 40 times 3, 120, and 7 times 3 is 21. Again, this addition is very simple, and so we reach the answer using very simple math skills. Another way of looking at this question, okay, and actually not solving it all the way through, is by using smart estimation. So when I look at this, I say, okay, I definitely know that I have to multiply 40 by 50. So what does this mean? This means that I know that my answer has to be upward of 2,000, right? It has to be at least more than 2,000. The other thing I can do is I can say, well, actually, I can sort of move around numbers a little bit and maybe shift the 3 over to here, and then I kind of have a basically 50 here and maybe 50 here. I rounded up the 47 to 50, and I rounded down the 53 to 50 as well. And what I get is give or take 50 times give or take 50 will give me give or take 2,500. And in fact, now I know that my answer must sit somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500, where I understand that it must be closer to 2,500 because my calculation here is very, very close. It's a close estimate, right? Closer than this estimate. So And we know that this is true because we just previously calculated it all the way through, and 2,500 is in fact very close to 2,491, which was the actual answer. So you know that it works, okay? And this is a very useful way of doing the calculation and figuring out what the answer is without actually having to calculate all the way through. Okay, next is using the process of elimination. Okay, there are a few rules that we can follow to eliminate efficiently. So the first thing is looking at the last digits or all of the digits in the answer options. So what do I mean by this? The first rule, again, these are things that you know very well, but sometimes what we know is not necessarily things that we also use to our advantage. So what I want to try to teach you today is how to take your knowledge and actually make it work for you. Okay, so when we multiply by 5, the last digit, right, of the answer of the product of the multiplication must be a 5 or a 0. What does this mean? This means that if I know that in the process of my question, I know that the final step was multiplying by 5, I don't even really need to do the multiplication. I can already look at my answer options, and any answer that does not involve a 5 or a 0 as the last digit, I can cross them out. We're going to see an example of that later on. This is extremely useful because then you're already narrowing down the options, maybe from 4 to 2 or even to 1, in which you know what the correct answer is. Similarly, the rule of 3, which I'm sure you know, the sum of digits in the answer must be divisible by 3. Okay, so if you want to know if a number, you can multiply it by 3, what you can do is you can take the digits of that number. So let's take an example so we can understand. Say the number 72. I want to know if there is any number that if I multiply it by 3, I'll get to 72. Well, the test is to see if it's divisible by 3. The way to do that is to take the 7 and the 2, meaning the digits of the number 72, and add them together. 7 plus 2 is 9, and 9 is in fact divisible by 3. Therefore, my answer is now I know that 72 is a number that's divisible by 3. How is this helpful to me? Well, again, if the final step of my question is to multiply something by 3, then I can automatically go to the answers without even doing the calculation. Say it's a complicated calculation, it's a big number that I'm multiplying by 3. Really, I would suggest that you start by going to the answers and just skimming through and eliminating any of the answers that include digits that the summation of them is not divisible by 3. Okay? And finally, remembering that multiplications of odds and evens have rules. So when we multiply even with even, the answer must be even. So again, without even doing the calculation, you can just go to the answers, and whichever answers you see are not even, just eliminate them. Even times odd, again, is equal to an even number, same thing, and odd times odd is equal to an odd number. So then you go to the answers and you eliminate any numbers that are even, okay? These are things that are well known. In a sense, you're probably thinking, okay, I know this, but it's a different thing to actually understand how to use this to your advantage. Okay, what we want to do is minimize the time we're spending calculating and maximizing the time we are reducing our options and figuring out which one is most likely to be correct. And finally, noticing extremes can also be helpful. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Sometimes there are like extreme answers, maybe a really big number or a very small number, and you can kind of look at them and very quickly understand that they're not really relevant to the range in which we're working with, right? If you make some kind of good estimate, and then you can eliminate them also easily. So that's also something to look out for. Okay, next we'll talk about tips for verbal reasoning. So this one is a little more intuitive, but still important to really focus our attention on. So we want to look for keywords that signal relationships. Okay, so we get a text or a passage, and we want to be able to understand what the different parts of the text are to one another, right? So a good way to do that is to recognize keywords like contrasting words like however, but, although, or cause and effect words like because, therefore, or consequently. In addition, I want you to learn how to practice active reading. What does this mean? It means I want you to ask yourself while you're reading, what's the main point? What are they trying to tell me? And try to briefly summarize what you just read in your head to yourself to reinforce understanding. Okay, this active reading is extremely helpful and will probably reduce the amount of times you need to kind of like repeat. Sometimes, you're not really focused and then you have to reread, and that's actually very time consuming, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. And finally, read the questions first. Okay, this is it's a way of getting an early understanding or an early idea of what you're supposed to actually focus on and look for within the text. So sometimes when you read a question first, you can kind of understand, oh, they're asking me what so-and-so person said about something. So then you can just go back to the passage and actually look for the name, right? And try to see what they're talking about. And then you can kind of maybe read less of the text. Okay, so you can minimize the amount of reading you have to do and really focus only on the relevant part of the text. However, I'm going to say this with a disclaimer. Be careful when you choose to do it like this, because it's very important that you actually understand the question fully. Okay, if you miss any part of the question, this might actually make you miss important parts of the text. So be aware. The next thing we're going to talk about, and the final section for today, is we're going to talk about how to manage our time in the most efficient way possible. What we want to do is make every minute count, or even every second count. And today we're going to talk about 4 major methods. So we'll talk about using elimination to our advantage, making good guesstimations. Okay, so making educated guesses and estimating efficiently. We'll also talk about the importance of practicing under real test conditions. And finally, how to do the test based on your strengths. Okay, so essentially really make your strengths work for you. So let's get into it. So the first thing we'll talk about today is elimination. The basic idea of elimination, and we touched on it a little bit earlier, is we want to narrow down the number of possible answers. Okay, by doing that, we can allow ourselves to focus on fewer choices and therefore make more confident decisions. Okay, so the best way to do that is, first and foremost, to eliminate clearly wrong options. By doing this, we already bump up our chances of guessing correctly just by lowering the number of options that we have to begin with. So let's take a look at an example. A bookstore sells 245 copies of magazines every day. How many copies will it sell in 5 weeks? Okay, I can start doing the actual calculation, or I can pay attention and notice that 5 times 5 equals 25, right? So the last digit times the last digit, and we talked about this earlier, is equal to 25. In this case, the last digit in my answer must have a 5 in it. So this automatically means that I can eliminate C and D. Look at that. So already I have a 50-50 chance of guessing the right answer. But now I can also make a smart estimation here, in which I know that 200 times 5 is 1,000. That's a pretty easy calculation. And I know that I have at least another 45. So A, 1,005 is a little too low, right? We can see that very easily. So therefore, that also must not be the answer. And so B is the answer. I want you to pay attention to what I did here and the way that I solved the problem. I know that I can do the full calculation. It's not that hard, but it's definitely faster to do it like this. And what we want to do is utilize our time to our advantage. We want to make the most of every second. Let's look at another example, this time from the verbal reasoning world in the form of a analogy question. So wolf is to howl as, person is to run, eat is to person, elephant is to meow, Dog is to sniff, and dog is to bark. First things first, the way that we solve analogy questions is that we must take the two main words and create a sentence that holds the relationship in it. The two main words in this case are, of course, wolf and howl. So the sentence I chose to put together is howl is the sound that a wolf makes, right? So what I can do is go one by one and go, okay, is run the sound that a person makes? No. Is person the sound that eat makes? No. I can do that. I can run through the whole thing. Or I can say to myself, okay, the relationship is sound. So howl must be a sound. The second word must be a sound. Is run a sound? No. Is person a sound? No. Is meow a sound? Yes. Is sniff a sound? No. Is bark a sound? Yes. Okay, so now I very quickly eliminated 3 of my options. And now it's actually easy for me to see, well, meow is not the sound that an elephant makes, so that's also not right. And then I'm left with bark is the sound that a dog makes, and therefore 5 is the correct answer. Okay, the next method is making good guesstimations. Okay, why do we want to do this? Because full calculations can be very time consuming, and we want to shy away from them as much as possible. Okay, using rough estimates can really quickly narrow down the answer possibilities. So let's look at an example. If a car travels 300 kilometers every week, there are 7 days in a week, at a constant speed, how many days does it take the car to travel 45% of 300 kilometers? Okay, and my options are A to D. Well, I can take this and say, okay, let me work with something that's a little easier for me. So I'm going to round up the 45% to 50% because it's much easier to work with 50%. So what do I know? I know that 50% of 300 kilometers is 150 kilometers. And I know that 50% of 7 days is 3.5 days. And what's the question asking me? Let me look again. How many days does it take the car to travel 45% of the distance? So, in fact, I'm looking at the days portion, right? So, I understand that my answer must be somewhere between 3 and 3.5 days because I rounded it up a little bit to 50%. So, it needs to be a little less than 3.5. Okay, so now I go to my answers. And I say, okay, well, 4 is definitely not the answer because that's too high, and 2.5 is too low. So I'm left with 3.5 and 3.15. Well, 3.5 can't be the answer because that's exactly 50% of the days. And well, 50% is what I rounded up. So it's got to be less than that. And therefore, I can eliminate that as well. And then without actually doing any crazy fancy calculations, I got to the answer. Now, I hope that some of you noticed that there's a little bit of irrelevant information here. And in fact, I spent some time focusing on something I didn't need to focus on. And that is, of course, the 50% of 300 kilometers. This was completely unnecessary information that was put in the question just to make you sort of fumble and focus on something that is not what you're actually being asked. Okay, so I want you to pay attention to this when you're practicing and looking at questions to see what are they asking me first of all. Okay, what is the actual question? Oh, I need to focus on the days, how many days? Okay, and if I read the question properly, I understand that it doesn't really matter how many kilometers the car travels in 7 days, right? It'll be the same because the car is traveling at a constant speed. Okay. Next, let's talk about the importance of practicing real test conditions. So one of the most effective ways that you can train yourself to deal with the time constraint is to create real test conditions. What does this mean? It means setting up a timer with the exact time limit of your exam. So if it's 30 minutes, then 30 minutes, and do a full simulation. Do a full run through. Don't cheat. Don't stop to go to the bathroom to do something else. Do a full sit down, do the whole thing from beginning to end. This is super important. And while you're doing it, I want you to glance at the clock every so often and actually write down next to the question that you're at where you've reached. Okay, so say after 7 minutes, I'm on question 4. Okay, I want you to Keep tabs on yourself throughout and understand how you're holding up with a time constraint. At the end, I want you to ask yourself these questions. Did I spend too much time on certain questions? Did I see all the questions? And are there question types that I answer faster? Essentially, what you're doing is you're collecting data on yourself. Okay, there's no better way to understand what your strengths are and your weaknesses are other than really looking at yourself, collecting data, understanding what you did better, where you need to work to improve. Okay, and the only way of doing that is really simulating true conditions so that you get a real understanding of where you're at. This brings us to the final point, which is um, recognizing your strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so we want you to work based on your strengths. Why is this? Because we don't want you to treat every question the same. Not every question is the same for you. Okay, for example, if you have 30 minutes to answer 30 questions, one might think, oh, that means that I have 1 minute per question, right? If 30 minutes to answer 30 questions, then I should allocate 1 minute per question. Well, in fact, that's probably not the best strategy for you. The reason this is true is because maybe you're good at passage questions, and maybe you struggle with analogies, say, for example. So, should you allocate the same time for questions that you're good at and questions that you're not good at? Well, in fact, there are two options. Sorry, one second. You have two options. You can either give yourself more time for analogy questions, right? The questions that you find more difficult. So you can decide, okay, to begin with, I know that I will give myself more time for these questions. Or you can actually go the opposite route. And you can say, I'm going to skip the analogy questions and I'll return to them at the end. There are different reasons to do each one of these options. And generally speaking, I would actually suggest that you skip over questions that you find very difficult to answer and that you generally don't do so well on. The reason that this is true is, as we talked about in the beginning, when we went over the format, so we talked about the fact that there's no penalty for wrong answers. Essentially, what you want to do is collect as many correct answers as you can. So we don't want to create a situation where you're stuck on questions that you eventually get wrong and then don't even see questions towards the end of your exam that you most likely would have gotten right. Okay, so we first want to make sure that we go through the entire test, we collect all the correct answers that we know we would get anyway, and then kind of revert back and try to make good estimations, eliminations, use the different tricks that we learned to maybe collect more. All right, good evening, everyone.